large spectrum of your research interests and also publications relate to the studies of culture and history of minority and diaspora groups in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and Eastern Europe in general. The study cases of your research are as diverse as the geography of these people, of these groups. But today I would like that we speak about a particular group and particular project that you started in 2008 at GWZO. That is the Armenian Project. But before we discuss the project, maybe it would be interesting to know how and when the study on Armenians in Eastern Europe came to your academic horizon.
Well, I would say that was a clear case of serendipity. I came across it without searching for it. I was doing archival work in the Swedish Royal Archives on a completely different topic, Swedish trade policies towards Muscovy in the 17th century. And the more I got to the end of the 17th century, the more sources on Armenian merchants on, at that time, Swedish territory, what is today Estonia, the city of Narva. Also the topic in Swedish trade policy towards Muscovy of including Iran into a, so to speak, transcontinental trade route from Isfahan in Iran via the Caspian Sea, Moscow, Novgorod, Narva, and from there to Amsterdam. A route for Armenian merchants bringing predominantly raw silk and other silk products from Iran to Western Europe in order to sell it for precious metals, particularly silver, because the Shah of Iran was in desperate need of precious metals. So that was the construction behind this Swedish plan. It was rather complicated to realize it, but then in the 1680s, even the Tsar agreed to this transit trade, which was very unusual because usually the Tsar did not open his realm for transit trade. And the Swedish crown then allotted to these Armenian merchants from Isfahan in the town of Narva on the Bay of Finland a trading house and supplied them with far-reaching privileges. And I thought, I had never heard of this Swedish then realized project. Also in the literature there was no information on that, so I thought, well, maybe I should copy all these documents because maybe one day they will come in handy. And indeed, as you mentioned, in 2008 I started to realize this project, which then over the years resulted in a specialized book series, Armenians in Eastern Europe.
You spoke about the Armenian Project at GWZO. I think the first phase of the project now it would be interesting to discuss, which was called Armenians in the Economy and Culture in East Central Europe from the 14th to 19th century. Could you please, which ran actually between 2008 and 2013 as a first phase, could you tell a bit of brief history of the project, the main profile, and also the main researchers in the project?
Well, in a certain sense, it also was a result of coincidence, because I think in 2007 I met a young Hungarian Armenologist at the University of Halle, which is very close to Leipzig. And Halle, I think in the early 1990s, had founded a research center on Armenian studies, the so-called Mesrop Center for Armenian Studies. And this Hungarian researcher by the name of Bálint Kovács, he at that time did his PhD there. And we discussed various questions on Armenian presence in Eastern Europe in the early modern period and later centuries. And it turned out that yes, there is research going on in this field, but mostly by individuals in the Ukraine, in Poland, Romania, Belarus, but there was no research center or research institution. So it was our idea to bring these individual researchers together for workshops, conferences here in Leipzig, and over the years to form a certain network. And that was very successful because most of these individual researchers before were not in contact among each others. And then when we started our book series, we invited all of them into the editorial committee of the book series, not only colleagues from Europe's eastern half, but also from other centers of research on Armenian topics like North America, France, Italy, Netherlands.
As you mentioned, the first phase of the project was ended in 2013, and a new phase of the project, the Armenian Project, so-called the editorial project Armenians, constitutes the continuation of the previous research project. To this end, a new book series, as you mentioned, Armenian östlichen Europa, Armenians in Eastern Europe, was established with an emphasis on the publication of current research, especially monographs and based on doctoral and habilitation projects. Right. Let me quote you actually on the editorial note that you wrote. This series will help to highlight the Armenian impact on the history and present of Eastern Europe, and simultaneously to put Southeastern Europe, East Central Europe and Eurasia on the global map of the Armenian diaspora. End quote. Could you please elaborate on the prehistory you already told, but the success of this book series? So, as we see, so we have already 6 volumes published and another 5 are in the pipeline in the upcoming 2 years at least. That would be interesting to know the content-wise also of this book series.
Well, in the book series, actually, we published 3 different types of texts. The first one is, as you mentioned, current research. The second one are translations of older research in quotation mark, exotic languages like Hungarian, Armenian, and so on. To make these research results accessible to a broader public. For example, a very important article by a colleague of mine from Yerevan, Shushanik Hachikyan, on the composition of these Armenian merchants in the 17th century. Existed only in Armenian language with a very short Russian summary. And so we decided to translate this article in one of our volumes, which is called, which we called an anthology, because it contained different types of texts, and thereby made it accessible to non-Armenian speaking specialists on the history of Armenians. And the third type of texts are translations from important historical travelogues, reports in Armenian by Armenians on Eastern Europe. For example, the latest issue is a travelogue by Minas Gyans on Eastern Europe, published in Armenian in 1830. It has, however, never been translated into any other language, so we translated it into Germans with annotations, bibliography, and all that. And I think that is an extremely interesting book, not only for experts on Armenians, Armenian history, Armenian presence in Eastern Europe, but for all historians dealing with the history of Eastern Europe in the 19th century and the knowledge outside of Eastern Europe on the region. Because Jans went there, so to speak, as a neutral observer. Of course, he had a certain focus on Armenian communities in the region, but he described all kinds of other facts, features, dimensions.
I think this series has a great value, particularly as mentioned, the translations are into two important languages for the science, English and German. And predominantly now we see German publications, but could you speak also about the future, the upcoming volumes? As you mentioned already, trade are one of the topics, and what else would be in the pipeline?
Well, we published a volume in English language on Armenian communities in today's Eastern Europe, a very systematical publication. So for each country today in the region, there is a chapter in the book. So on the one hand, we have this special interest in previous centuries, but we also are, of course, very much interested in the present. One of our next publications also will be a translation. Again, in my view, an extremely interesting merchant's handbook written by Lukas Vanandetsi, an expert, an Armenian expert in trade, who, so to speak, copied this genre of merchant handbooks, which in the 17th century, 18th century was very popular in Europe. For example, in the German language, there are, I would say, a dozen of such handbooks, particularly written by one famous and popular author at the time, Marperger, who wrote merchants' handbooks on individual countries like Muscovy, Russia, Sweden, the Netherlands in German language, and explained to his colleagues how the terms of trade, how to bribe a customs official and all this and that. And Vanandetsi produced a handbook over all of Europe, including Eastern Europe, Western, Southern. And I think compared to the state of knowledge of the West German authors of this genre of merchants' handbooks, Vanandetsi was much more informed. So we look very much forward once the book is published in German translation, what experts on European economic history in the early modern period have to say on the quality of Vanandetsi's information.
What comes to my mind after speaking also to you and also knowing a bit about the book series, that this is a very unique book series, not only for Germany, but also for the European space, for the European academic space, right? A couple of days ago, we got to know that in the American universities, they established a new book series by the modern Armenia. But I think this is a very specific and very unique book series with its content, with its regional focus, because I think Eastern Europe was a bit of neglected, at least in the historical research on the Armenians.
I think you're perfectly right. In international historiography on Eastern Europe, medieval ages, early modern period, late modern period, there is this perception that in Eastern Europe, you find, of course, East Europeans, various nations with different ethnogenesis, speaking Slavic languages, Hungarian, Romance language, and so on and so forth, plus two important minority groups, that is Germans or German speakers and Jews. And in this perception, two other groups usually are neglected. One is Roma, which today is the largest minority group in the region, and also Armenians. And there was always this argument, yeah, but Armenians, they were very few, which somehow is true, somehow not. First of all, impact, economic impact, cultural impact, political impact is not measured by the numbers of a minority. And second, in the eastern half of Europe, you have this very interesting phenomenon of Armenian towns, exclusively inhabited by Armenians, or parts of larger towns as a sort of Armenian suburb quarter. Extreme cases are in Transylvania, today Romania, Armenopolis and Elisabetopolis. But we also have similar cases in Ukraine, for example, Kamenets-Podolsk, and a case which by now is at least a bit more well known, Leopolis, Lemberg, Lwów in Polish, as an important religious, cultural center for Armenians, who in the early modern period in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths had a unique, privileged status, including their own judiciary, church organization, and so on and so forth. So, how to say, leaving out the Armenians from the overall picture of Eastern Europe definitely is not advisable for a historian dealing with the history of the region.
Now, if we move to the current stage of the research in Leipzig about the Armenians, I'm telling and why it's interesting to know that I think Leipzig became actually in the last decades a place to study Armenians, Armenian culture and Armenian history, particularly with a focus on Armenians in Eastern Europe, but nevertheless in other geographical locations as well. What is happening now? Why I'm telling this? Because you have so many PhD students, and you had so many PhD students whose research on Armenian culture and history on diverse topics and also diverse periods, so were supervised by you actually, right, till today. And I think it's an interesting place, and it's an interesting moment that Leipzig actually became the place to study Armenian culture and history. What would you think about that?
Yes, but I would not forget the role of Halle, which has a much longer tradition in Armenian studies than Leipzig. For example, in GDR times, I think there were only two Armenian families living in Leipzig. But one should not forget that on the territory of GDR, 500,000 of Soviet citizens were stationed, most of them as rank and file NCOs and officers of the Soviet armed forces, but also, of course, their wives, children, and civil employees. And among them was also a certain percentage of Soviet citizens from the then Soviet Armenia. And interestingly enough, quite a number of them remained after the retreat of the Soviet armed forces, or at that time already Russian armed forces in 1994. So due to the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, the number of Armenians in what in German is called Mitteldeutschland, like Saxony, Thuringia, Sachsen-Anhalt, interestingly enough, increased. And then, as you mentioned, we also had this process that once one Armenian PhD student got his PhD in Leipzig. Probably he or she told other students who then also thought maybe it would be a good idea to come to Leipzig. That, by the way, is also the result why we have an Armenian Student Association in the town, which is very active in the public realm, commemorating the genocide in cooperation with the Protestant Church and other institutions. So it's like so to speak, like a snowball system, and I think that is the reason why we today have this situation here, which is of course completely different from the former western part of Germany, where most Armenians came as Gastarbeiter from Turkey in the 1960s and 70s, but interestingly enough also formed sort of colonies. For example, the city of Cologne, I would say, is one of the centers. In Eastern Germany, of course, Berlin, at that time still the eastern part of Berlin, capital of GDR, also had a certain percentage of Armenian population, but that was due to the fact of intense cooperation between research institutes, universities, and so on in East Berlin with institutions in the Soviet Union, including, again, the Soviet Armenian Republic.
As you mentioned, how the group of the Armenian students is coming to Leipzig, it reminded me as a process of becoming a diaspora, as a certain type of diaspora, and reminded me that Leipzig in the 19th and early 20th century was a very important city for the Armenian intellectuals to come and study. This is kind of a bringing the history back, actually, of course, on another occasions, on another historical circumstances, but this is a kind of a place for the Armenians to study. And about the actual research at GWZO about the Armenian Project, could you also please elaborate on this topic?
As I mentioned, we have several volumes in the book series in pipeline, including, by the way, your PhD on the Armenian diasporic field in post-89 Hungary, with this specific development that the post-communist government in Hungary set up a system of self-administration for national minorities, including, of course, the Armenians. Current research is also carried out by Bálint Kovács, who a couple of years ago, in addition to his position at our center, was nominated Professor of Armenian Diaspora Studies at the Catholic Peter Pázmány University in Budapest, where also not only an MA program is conducted in Armenian Diaspora Studies, but Bálint Kovács managed to contract quite a number of experts on the history of Armenians to teach in this MA program. So I would say we somehow succeeded in exporting our idea to focus on Armenians in Eastern Europe to the very region that is Eastern Europe, or in this case, Hungary as a country of East Central Europe. And maybe I also should add that currently we have a fellow, also an expert on Armenian history from Ukraine, he came here under a special German fellowship scheme for endangered scholars, because his Institute of Higher Education was located in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass, in Kramatorsk, a city which, in the initial phase of the process of building up the separatist republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, was I would say, a theater of war. So his institution was closed down, but with the help of this funding scheme, we could bring him to Germany, and he is doing research on Armenians in two directions. One is also focusing on the 17th century, when these, so to speak, Armenian communities, colonies in Eastern Europe were established. And he also has a special focus on current development, conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, Azerbaijan, Armenia, post-Soviet realm.
And maybe we also speak about the cooperation partners of GWZO, particularly with regard to the Armenian Project.
Well, of course, we have a number of partners in Armenia, particularly Matenadaran, but also the university. And we have, I would say, in almost each and every East European country, either an individual partner or, for example, when I take the example of Poland, we have a colleague in Krakow, Professor Stopka, who, I would say 5 years ago, founded a specialized yearbook on the history of Armenians in Poland, Lithuania, and then later on Poland. It is in Polish, but the title is in Armenian Lech HaHayer. And similar contacts we have, for example, in Sofia in Bulgaria. Bulgaria has also a small Armenian minority, which, however, compared to other national minorities in this country, is rather visible. That has to do with the fact that Armenians in Bulgaria are mostly city dwellers, whereas most other national minorities are, so to speak, rural minorities. Maybe that explains something. Also, there is an Armenian church organization, and in Plovdiv, the third largest city of the country, there is a whole agglomeration, Armenian school, Armenian church, Armenian library, very nicely located on a hill in the old part of town. And of course, in the Russian Federation, we have quite a number of contacts, again, mostly to individual scholars, and of course, Hungary, the mentioned Catholic Peter Basmany University, where Bálint Kovács has his chair.
And what about financial partners? It's like sponsors. I know that we have third-party sponsors as well, and also local German.
Yes. When we started our research project, we got funds from the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Lately, we got contributions by the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation from Lisbon in Portugal. Currently, we prepare a project application to Fritz Thyssen Stiftung. That's a private German foundation which has a focus on history. In Germany, we have the the very convenient situation that next to governmental funders, we have quite a number of private foundations which finance research in the fields we are interested in, like economic history, history of culture, national minorities, and so on and so forth. So we are quite optimistic to be able to finance our research also in the near future.